To render a high quality image of your model, the first thing you need to do is add a camera to the scene. You can do that by going to Add, Camera, or you can use Shift A to bring up this menu and insert the camera from there. With the camera in the scene, you can use the transformation gizmo to move the camera and hit number pad 0 to see through the camera itself. In this view, if you come over to the right side here, you'll see that there's a tab that says View. If you drop down View, there's an option which says Lock Camera to View. Select that, and then you're able to move your mouse and position the camera as you want. When you have a composition that you're happy with, you can then deselect Lock Camera to View, and any mouse movement will take you back out to this view here. Now with the camera in the scene, let's look at rendering. On the right hand side, there's a tab which says Render Properties, and there you'll see Render Engine. By default, Blender is set to Eevee Render Engine, which is a real-time render engine. It's very, very quick, so it's very good in production when you want to see how things will look in the render in real time. If you drop down, you'll see there are two other options, Workbench, which we won't look at in this tutorial, and Cycles, which we will look at in a little bit. So the first thing we'll try and do is render an image using the Eevee Render Engine. At the moment, what we're looking at is a solid view. It doesn't represent what we'll see when we render our image. To see that, you need to come over to the rendered option, and let's see now what this looks like when we render it out. To render the image, you can come to Render, Render Image, or hit F12. What you'll see here is that actually the render is not the same to what we can see in the scene view, and I'll show you why. To make the scene view and the render view match, you need to come over here to the top right, Shading, drop down, and select Scene Lights and Scene World. And we can see our objects now, however, they're very dark because we need a light. So what we'll do is we'll go to Shift A to bring up that menu again, go to Light, and there are plenty of lights that we could add, but for this tutorial we'll add points. So with a point light in the scene, the first thing that we notice is it's very dim and we need to make it brighter. To do that, we come over to the tab here where we can see a light icon, and we can just pull the power up or down depending on how bright we want the light to be. If we want to add another light in the scene, a quick way to do this would be to select the light and select Shift D to duplicate that light. So lighting is very dependent on the model that you're trying to light, the look that you're going for. So at this stage, I'd say just play with the lights, experiment with the intensity, the positioning, and also the number of lights in the scene. The next thing I'd like to do is add a base for my models, so there's a surface for them to sit on, and also a backdrop behind. The way that I tend to do this is to go to Shift A, the menu again, select Mesh, Plane, and this will bring a plane into the scene. To scale it, in object mode, we can just use S, and now we have a base. To quickly add a backdrop, if you tab into edit mode, or alternatively use the drop down here, make sure you have the edge select, and select this back edge. If we type E to extrude the edge, we can then use the transform gizmo to pull that edge upright. If we tab back into object mode, we'll notice there's a hard edge which we don't want, so we can go back into edit mode, select that edge, and use Ctrl B to bevel. So when I pull my mouse back and forward, the bevel gets smaller or it gets larger, and I can use my middle mouse to decide how many faces I have in that particular bevel. If we tab back to object mode, we'll notice it's very subtle, but there are some ridges here. To remove those, bring up the menu by selecting F3 and typing in Shade Smooth. When you select that, you'll notice that the ridges are gone. So to see this through our camera, we can hit 0. We can see that the backdrop is too small. So with the backdrop selected, hit S, scale it so it's outside of the camera view. And now what I'd like to do is see how this looks again in the render. So we go to render image, our objects are lit and they're on a base. Now let's compare this with cycles. If we go back to the render tab here and we use Cycles, we'll see that the effect is quite different. Cycles is physically based, so there's a high level of realism. As we're rendering a high quality image, I'd recommend using cycles for this purpose. So let's render this image. So you'll see straight away that it takes a bit longer than Eevee to render. But also what's quite noticeable is that in these shadowed areas, the quality is quite low. And what I'd like to do is show you how to increase the quality using samples. So let's cancel this render and go back to the render properties. And there you'll see there's a drop down sampling. By default, it's on 64. If you increase this number, the quality of your model will improve, however the render will take longer. And it's really a case of trial and error. A good starting point might be, say, 400, but of course you can increase this if that's not high enough, and just keep experimenting with the number of samples that you use for your particular image. Before we render this image, I just want to show you quickly how to change the color of light. So if you select a light and then go to this tab here again, you can see it's currently a white. So you can just use the color wheel to change the light. Another thing to note is that you can decide whether a light casts shadows or not by toggling on the cast shadows box. And now we can see how this looks in the render. So render image or F12. And once the render's finished, you can just go to image, save, and then save the image on your machine. So I'm going to speed up the render. But in this tutorial, we've looked at the basics of lighting and how to render in Eevee and Cycles.